passages to give a brief idea of some of the main points that I hope that the book gets across. And then if people do have questions or things we want to talk about, like, any of the teases from that bio that Chris just read, or anything pertaining particularly to video games and playing during this strange time of quarantine and lockdown, I'd be happy to hear from people and get a discussion going around that. So yeah, so I'll start by just reading a little bit directly from the book that I think hopefully in about 10 minutes will give a little concise idea of a lot of what this book is trying to do in terms of changing the conversation around video games and why we play them and what role they play in our mental health. So this is sort of a bit of a piecemeal reading from the second chapter of the book. Okay. So say your favorite book is The Once and Future King by T.H. White. Good choice. Its humor and humanity forever altered the way you think about the power of old stories to inform contemporary problems. Perhaps you first read the novel during a difficult time in your life, and its worn pages still bring you comfort in times of need. Now imagine trying to explain your relationship with The Once and Future King to a person who has never read a book before, indeed has made a point of avoiding even reading about books. He's heard that they can be addictive, that they're meant only for children, and then mumbles something about being pretty sure that scientists identified books as a cause of adolescent delinquency. His singular point of contact, he tells you, occurred 2 years ago when he briefly leafed through a copy of something called Web Design for Dummies, after a coworker, whom everyone knew to be a bit of a weirdo, left it lying around. He says he found the text indecipherable and felt vindicated in his decision to avoid the medium altogether. You can picture the skepticism on his face when you say that White's Arthurian epic changed your life. Abandon hope of any nuanced discussion surrounding theme, prose style, or why the work speaks to your lived experience. This person lacks the basic context with which to understand what a book has the potential to be. He's shocked to learn, for instance, that The Once and Future King is structured as a narrative, having assumed every book, like the one he scorned a couple of years back, to be a compilation of how-to bullet points. The idea that a book can center around people, places, and events that do not exist in the real world, or that their authors often have creative aspirations beyond instructing readers on how to build a homepage, equally astonishes. This is how it can feel to try to talk about video games with those who have little experience with them. There's a fundamental semantic gap, a dearth of shared vocabulary between those who play and those who don't. If one's only frames of reference are mainstay work distractors like Tetris or Minesweeper, and I launch into an explanation of Silent Hill 2's grotesque surrealism, I might as well be speaking in tongues. Lack of exposure is only part of the problem, though, as that lack is rarely coincidental. Like our book poor friend above, many people deliberately avoid games due to an omnipresent stigma that has spread in mainstream discourse for decades. Games are considered to be fringe, unhealthy, dangerous. Since the late 1990s, they have been at the center of fiery political debates about the cause of mass violence. And despite a consistent lack of evidence to support such a connection, public perception has been undeniably impacted. At best, games are seen to have the power to frivolously distract, at worst, to corrupt and disfigure. Games are difficult to explain to others because so much of their meaning exists within the bubble of time and space shared only between player and game. Stripped of this context, the game can seem inscrutable. To wit, perhaps the best-known franchise in the medium's history centers around an Italian plumber striving to rescue a princess from turtle monsters with the aid of magic mushrooms. From this vantage point, the idea that Mario, first seen in 1981's Donkey Kong and appearing since in over 200 titles, has persisted as a cultural icon for nearly 4 decades can only strike one as absurd. As I began to consider how to think about games from the perspective of a clinical psychologist who assumes meaning behind the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of others, however trivial they may appear at first glance, I realized that my profession has a similar stigma for people unfamiliar with it. Therapy, too, can appear bafflingly opaque when viewed from outside the patient-therapist relationship. When asked what happens in session, a patient tells her friend accurately, "We talk." The friend looks at her like she's being taken for a ride. How can talking make any appreciable difference in her life? Our culture is quick to dismiss the psychological as being less real than other domains of life. A medical illness is serious, while anxiety is just in your head. If I were to tell a stranger at a party that I'm a dermatologist, this person I've never met before might promptly roll up his sleeve and ask, if it's not too much trouble, that I help put his mind to rest about a mole. But instead, I say clinical psychologist, and the stranger often goes quiet, changes the subject, or awkwardly declares that he'd better watch what he says around me, as though merely speaking to someone fluent in psychological issues would expose him, infect him, in the same way that talking about games would invite some antisocial or addictive menace to cross his threshold. Games and psychotherapy are not innately dangerous, but their meaning can be hard to grasp from the outside. Their functions, trappings, and potential benefits are inextricably linked with the relationships in which they occur, whether player-game or patient-therapist. It is only through looking at these relationships that we might reach a new understanding and the ability to communicate about games across groups and individuals who have varying levels of hands-on knowledge. I'm skipping a few pages to give a specific example of that kind of relationship. Patricia, a patient I saw for weekly psychotherapy for a number of years, once recounted to me her singular requirement when shopping for a new game. It had to be big. The lush wetlands of a fantasy kingdom or the streets of a crime-ridden city were immaterial as compared to sheer size. Not surprisingly, she was drawn to open-world games, so called because of the immensity of their virtual environments and their emphasis on the player's freedom to do or not do as she pleases within them. Typically, there's a central storyline that the player may follow, but tasks associated with this route pale in comparison to the myriad locations, interactions, and challenges that the player can discover through self-guided exploration. The systems in these titles is defined by the designer's efforts to disguise that there is a system. This is never truly possible, of course, but the illusion of an unfettered world can be facilitated by highlighting breadth over depth. By leaning into the strength of a computer-powered medium, the most successful open-world games are so chock full of stuff to do and places to go that the limitations of how deeply the player can engage with any specific instance feels less overbearing and engenders the liberating sensation that you can go anywhere and do anything. For Patricia, living in a massive game world was the primary purpose of playing. She rarely played more than one game at a time, preferring instead to mine a single title until she felt she had exhausted everything it had to offer. A virtual world so large and dense that many players will see only a fraction of everything within it can be intimidating to some, particularly those who derive satisfaction from feeling they have unambiguously completed a game. But Patricia said she depended on games not running out of material. I don't see the point of starting if I know it will be over in a few hours, she told me. When we began working together, her game, as she often referred to it, was Fallout 4, released in 2015 and set in post-apocalyptic New England. Considered to be on the smaller end of contemporary open world standards in terms of geographic area, one estimate placed the game's map at about 1 square mile of virtual terrain. It would take a player's character 11 minutes to sprint across it from end to end. There's no particular reason to do so, however, as that square mile is densely packed with characters to interact with and missions to complete, as well as the more open-ended tasks of scrounging for weapon and armor modifications and building settlements in the irradiated deserts of post-apocalyptic Massachusetts. At a moderate clip, forsaking many of the optional paths and details the world has to offer, Fallout's central plot can be completed in well under 60 hours. Patricia logged over 600. She wasn't bad at the game, far from it. She played Fallout in survival mode, a setting that modified the game system to more realistically simulate the brutality and challenge of post-apocalyptic existence. In this mode, the player's character had to eat, drink, and sleep regularly with numerous caveats to these necessities. Sleeping less than 7 in-game hours at a stretch yielded limited benefit. The unsanitary overuse of a single mattress could lead to illness. Food had to be consumed regularly, but if the player's character ever resorted to cannibalism to fulfill this requirement, no other food source would satisfy her moving forward. Fast travel, a feature that allowed players to instantly transport to locations she had previously visited, was disabled in this mode. The basic act of navigating the world was a slow, considered process. In brief, survival mode made Fallout much, much harder, and surely from some players' point of view, it rendered the game an unplayable slog. But Patricia relished the opportunity to live more authentically inside the game, which felt even bigger for all the extra work survival mode demanded from her to move about and stay alive. Patricia deliberately avoided Fallout's main storyline and the basic concerns of food, water, and shelter provided, provided endless justification to eschew completing the game in favor of prolonging her time in its world. The player's representation within game space, that is to say her character, is the vessel through which all thrills and frustrations of play are vicariously experienced. And in some cases, such as in Fallout, the player can build her character from the ground up, dictating broad strokes like gender, height, and build, as well as tweaking minute facial details from jawline to nose size to type of earlobe, adding tattoos and scars, perfecting hairstyle, clothing, and accessories. The player is free to sculpt herself from unmolded clay, and in so doing, identify an aspect of herself within its form. Identification, the process of locating oneself in an external subject, is often central to the enduring appeal of game characters and the emotional attachment players develop toward them. How the player approaches the freedom of character creation in a game like Fallout says a great deal about how she relates to her character, and thus what aspects of herself she is exploring through the prism of the game. One player might build a character that resembles herself in real life as closely as possible. Another builds an idealized proxy, an Adonis of culturally valued traits. Still others may gravitate toward a character that, at least on the surface, seems completely unrelated to who she is in the physical world. Patricia's character was a man, and ugly. She made him short, stocky, with beady eyes and a bulbous nose, short-cropped neon green hair and unsightly blemishes covering his face. Her initial insights into why she had meticulously crafted this particular avatar were superficial, to say the least. I thought he looked funny, she told me. But to leave the matter there would be to discard the significant time she spent building the character, not to mention playing as him, as meaningless. From a physical perspective, Patricia was the inverse of her Fallout character. Tall, slender, with striking angular features, she had explored being a fashion model in her late teens in lieu of attending university. Patricia returned home unannounced one day from an extended stint in Europe, telling her mother that she had changed her mind about her career path and that she wanted to go back to school. It would be years before she disclosed to anyone that she'd been sexually assaulted by a photographer after a shoot, beginning a spiral of shame and anxiety. The once glamorous idea of being a model had become repugnant to her. Over time, Patricia became willing to consider that her Fallout character, whom she referred to as Pat, was not a random creation. She desired him as an alter ego precisely because he looked undesirable. Having long internalized her physical attractiveness as the cause of unwanted advances from men, Patricia found solace in playing as a character with a face that, as she put it, not even a mother could love. This sentiment also belied the resentment Patricia felt in acting as caretaker to her mother, the woman who had pushed Patricia into pageantry and modeling from pre-adolescence. Pat was a repudiation of everything people had told Patricia made her special, yet still he survived, hour after hour, in the unforgiving wastes of Fallout, and in survival mode, no less. He symbolized freedom from the expectations of family and society. As no one could possibly want anything from such a creature, Patricia could inhabit him for an hour here or there in order to take care of herself. So I'll stop there. Just say that represents something of a quick example of various themes that I talk about throughout the book and talk about with patients and with other people about video games, that really centers around the idea of not treating games as these broad, scary, monolithic things that sort of come into our lives and exert their influence on us, but rather as specific and varied pieces of art, interactive art, that we get into specific relationships with, and that those specific relationships can really tell us a lot about our own psychology, our own phase of life that we're going through, and in some ways can actually be therapeutic. So that's really all that I had pre-planned. I know we're a small group and a group of and mostly people that are welcome familiar faces to me. But if anyone has any thoughts or questions, or Krista, if you have anything on your mind, I'd be happy to sort of open us up to a discussion.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute us all, but if anybody's having a particular racket in their home and don't want to be unmuted, you can mute yourself again after I've done this. And thank you so much for that passage. I am one of those people that's in the ignorant category about video games. I have 2 girls and they don't play at all. Nothing. Like they get to do a little bit of a math video game because I've deemed that's the only thing appropriate for them, but they also have pretty much had 0 interest, which I have to admit has made me pretty happy.
How old are they, if you don't mind?
They're 9 and 11. And there seems to be such a gender division in their own understanding of it because they know boys play whatever it is, the name of things that boys are playing right now. So then the boys they know are, I would use the word addicted. That's what my daughter calls it. And she's worried for them.
So in and of itself, it's such an interesting and common cultural perception we have, right? There are a few things that we feel like we know about video games, right? We know that they're bad for you. We know that they're addictive. We know that they're mostly for young boys to play and let out aggressive, and be violent. None of which are really supported by science, right? That boys under 18 represent a minority of total game players. Actually, more women over 30 play video games than boys under 18.
Wow.
But that isn't to say that those sort of ideas, that these things that we think we know aren't really impactful on how we engage with games, understand games, how we talk about them, and the judgments that we bring on them. Which isn't to say that if your children have never expressed any interest in them, that they ought to be playing games, right? Just like anything else, right? As we should be free to explore the things that are of interest to us. But I do wonder, in cases like that where as a child or an adult, your sort of sense is that games are something that are dangerous, right? That are making people addicted, right? It would really affect the willingness that you might have to dip your toe into that water or not, and it would make a parent understandably trepidatious about allowing their child to dip their toe into that water if the thought is that doing so could send them down a slide into some really maladaptive, pathological place. The point about addiction, right, which is something that it's even included in the bio on the back of the book, that I don't really support the use of the term video game addiction, is really about, and something I talk about in a whole chapter devoted to addiction in the book, is that I think the problem with this way that we often talk about video games is that we talk about them as addictive in the way that we talk about substances. And the fact of the matter is, it's just that video games are not a substance. They don't exert influence on brain chemistry the way that substances do, right? If you take cocaine or you drink alcohol, we know what it's going to do to your brain. They're just these simple chemicals. They do the same thing every time. And not everybody gets addicted, but the addictive potential lies within the substance. Video games are not like that, right? As you say, like your daughters, Krista, whatever they've been exposed to, like they didn't like it, right? It just didn't grab their attention, right? And some people will play a game and they'll say, that's okay, or this is stupid, and they'll never pick it up again. And somebody else might become completely infatuated with it. Games are way too complex to put them in the same category as substances. So when someone develops an unhealthy relationship with a game, which is absolutely a thing that does happen, I think it's much more useful, rather than thinking about the game as something addictive that's grabbed hold of the person, to think of it as something within the person has really found root in the game, right? So rather than calling a game addictive, I tend to refer to these kinds of behaviors as compulsive play, right? That something from inside the individual, child or adult, is really having a hard time not returning to whatever emotional, psychological experience the game's offering them over and over again, without necessarily an understanding of why they're doing it. And so the difference there is that when you look at something as addictive, the clear way of treating an addiction is to remove the substance, right? To remove the addictive property. So if it's a game, then to remove the game, which in a lot of substance use treatment too is often found to be not particularly effective, because whatever purpose the thing is serving, the person just needs to find it somewhere else. Looking at it as compulsive play means that what we need to do first and foremost is understand, why is the person drawn to this game so much? Right? What is it doing for them? What might the virtual world and the things that one can do within that virtual world be offering that this child or adult is having a hard time finding elsewhere in their life, right? And sometimes it's not as frightening or sort of pathological as you might think. Sometimes what you discover is that actually a person feels way more extroverted and social in the game environment than they do in the social environments in their in school or in other areas of their life. Sometimes it may be that a person is finding a sense of competence and confidence. They're able to accomplish something and be good at something in a video game that they're really struggling to feel like they're good at anywhere else. And so in those cases, the method of treatment from my perspective and in my practice is not to remove the game, but actually to help the individual think about ways in which they can be more like they are in the game elsewhere in their life, and see the virtual world and who they are in the virtual world as something meaningful rather than something to be ashamed of.
It's so enlightening. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to open it up to other people.
It's making me wonder, I sort of have a general question. Do you see similarities or draw parallels between how people use video games and how they use social media?
I think that social media is definitely can belong to a broader category in the same respect, right? Where people have specific relationships with social media and it serves functions in their lives, absolutely. And so I think that you can ask the same kinds of questions to somebody who's really a heavy user of social media or not, but but especially if it's something that is of concern, to be curious about what people get out of it. Because like video games, I think social media, we have this term, like we say video games, we say social media as though it's one thing, but of course it's not, right? That somebody who is spending hours and hours a day on Twitter versus somebody who's spending hours and hours a day on Instagram are actually doing very different things. What those platforms do and how you engage with them are not the same. And the extent to which someone is participating versus observing, the extent to which somebody has a community or is in contact with people, and the extent to which somebody is experiencing different kinds of emotions, right? That or is somebody using Instagram looking for likes and validation for some aspect of themselves that they're trying to curate and put online, or is somebody going on Twitter to anonymously troll people and try to get people to come back at them with aggressions, so that they feel some release from that. It's so variable, right? It's as variable as people are. And so similarly, I think trying to understand why people are doing the things that they do is always a better route to change than just saying this thing is bad, so let's just rip it out of your life. And the main thing that makes something compulsive, right, is that it provides some kind of gratification, some sort of a loop, but that loop is never being reflected upon, right? The essence of psychotherapy is this dialectic between experience and reflection, right? You live, you feel things, you think things, you do things, and then you pause to reflect on what that stuff means. And the same thing can apply for how we use technology, how we use games, how we use social media, that you can learn a lot about yourself in terms of the games that you play or the way that you use Twitter or whatever it might be, if you pause and think about it. And that can be really hard to do, and that's why having parents who are open to talking to their kids about why they use technology the way they do in an open-minded, non-judgmental way can be really helpful. It's why therapy can be really helpful, right? Allowing there to be a space where it's okay to talk about the meaning behind these behaviors with technology in our lives that are so prevalent, right? That we spend so much of our time doing, but are so often filled with this sense of embarrassment or shame, like we shouldn't be talking about it, or it's not something that we should lend any sense of meaning to.
And sort of to piggyback on that, I'm curious now, with everyone isolated and quarantined at home, are you seeing video, are you talking to patients, or are you predicting that video game use will change? Or how are video games playing a role in people's lives now that it's one of fewer options?
I mean, it's definitely already having a big impact. It'll be interesting to see the longer term impacts, as opposed to this sort of immediate reaction to quarantine and lockdown. Even before we started, Krista was saying how she feels like there may be even some sort of Zoom fatigue around these kinds of virtual events, where at the start everyone was like, oh, we can do the same stuff we always did, but like online. And now, some of that inevitably wears off. But yeah, I mean, I think anecdotally, a lot of my patients who are not typically people who play a lot of games or who would rarely talk about it in session have bought games for the first time or dusted off really old ones that they haven't looked at in a really long time, particularly certain games that have a social component, are really popular right now for obvious reasons. And then a little less anecdotally, there's been a huge uptick in usage of in game purchasing, but also usage of sites like Twitch, where essentially watch people playing games and can sort of socially participate with professional players and professional streamers. There was a chart I saw, maybe in the New York Times or somewhere, that basically showed like ESPN's.com's usage was like going like this as all these professional sports seasons were canceled, and Twitch just like soaring up, right? So there's some compensation happening between as physical recreation is less available, virtual recreation becomes more appealing. So if I had to guess, I'd say that some of that will just wear off with time. But then some people may have discovered a pastime or an interest that they didn't know that they had that will stick. And I certainly think that games being this thing where you can potentially be together virtually with a shared purpose, right? It's not just like hanging out in a Zoom chat, but you're sort of all meeting in this virtual space to do something together, which is like what we like to do in our real lives when we're not quarantined at home. Like sometimes we like to hang out, but sometimes we might actually like to like go and see a movie, right? Or go and like play mini golf, right? These sort of, where we're all experiencing something together that we can talk about and reflect on and have as a shared experience. That's something that games can offer, right? That it's a way to do something together just without having to be in the same room.
Anybody with more questions want to unmute yourselves?
Can you talk a little more about your recommendations for parents of like elementary and junior high school students who are concerned about them and they're playing video games?
Sure. And hi, Eve. That's my mother-in-law. Yeah, I mean, I think that the most important idea, which is so simply stated, and yet on some level, I took sort of I also felt like it required a book to sort of sell, because it is coming up against so many decades of stigma against games, is to for parents to be open to talking to their kids about games in a compassionate way, right? That meaning being open to really genuinely, curiously talking to their kids about why what games they're playing right now, what are those games like, what do they like about them. There's I don't work a lot with children in my clinical practice. I work with sort of mid to late adolescence and up. But there is one sort of anecdote in the book where I was doing a consultation with a younger child, or school-age child, who was about 10, and where that sort of went was his mother recognizing that she took a very judgmental standpoint towards the game without even realizing it. He played a lot of Minecraft, was sort of his game of choice, and played it with his friends, and that without even realizing it, she would say things like, this thing's rotting your brains, or this, and it actually kind of had frightened him over time, and he really felt like he was doing something bad when he was playing this game. But it also was this very important sort of social gathering point for his friends, and something he really liked a lot. And what ultimately ended up happening through my conversations with this boy's mother, and just sort of through her own exploration, was she created a ritual that she referred to as their Minecraft talks, where they would periodically sit down and chat about what he was doing in the game, and really treat it as something interesting and serious, like you might talk to your kid about what's been going on at school, or what they're into or excited about, or how soccer practice went, or whatever it might be. That seeing it as an actual legitimate jumping off point for parent and child to bond. And through that, she found that she learned a lot about what this game meant to him and how many thoughts and feelings he had around it. And I think, interestingly but not uniquely, she found that after sort of establishing this routine, it became a lot easier for her to set boundaries around the game, because it was no longer her kind of coming out of left field for reasons that her son didn't understand, saying, you got to turn this off now, or like, no more games for the rest of the weekend. It started to feel more like she understood what the game was to him, and she appreciated it. And so if she said enough was enough, then like that had a certain credibility that went with it. Just like I think in general, parents recognize that limit setting is easier if it is coherent to the child, but if the reason for the boundary has something, has a sense of logic or solidity to it. And so I think the same goes for games.
I have a follow-up that I remembered. The game my daughter is talking about, all the boys are playing, is Fortnite, and I don't know it at all, but my understanding from a distance is that people are shooting each other, and that these kids are playing, you know, long past when they're supposed to be going to bed, because somehow it's allowed in their bedroom, and so they're tired in the morning, and they've been shooting everybody all night. So how do you feel about the violence component?
Yeah, so and Fortnite's a very interesting game. It's one that it's hugely popular, but also, as is not uncommon with games, it rose in popularity so quickly that it was only sort of as a afterthought that I mentioned it a couple of times in the book, because it didn't exist while I was writing the book. It sort of sprung up so quickly, but is now a really big phenomenon. So it is a game that one might in some ways categorize as a violent video game, though the way that, just like how we often talk about games as this one thing, we also talk about violent video games as this one thing, when in fact, just like it would be weird to say like violent movies, right? That like watching like a gory, horror movie that is intended to be sort of shocking and phantasmagoric versus like The Godfather, right, which is also a violent movie. They're not the same thing, and they don't evoke the same emotional experiences, and people don't necessarily seek them out for the same reasons. So video games are very similar. Some games are violent, but take the violence seriously, or don't. And Fortnite is in this sort of realm where it is sort of cartoon violence. So there is absolutely shooting. The point of the game is it's a shooter, and but it's not bloody, and it's depicted in a sort of cartoonish way. And basically, it's a battle royale is how Fortnite works. So it's 100 players are on the same server, all playing together, and you play until there's one person left. And I think that, again, there's a lot of different things that people get out of it. There's a competitiveness, there's a social aspect, there's a sense of accomplishment, there's a sense of competition and victory over a large group of real people. And I don't inherently think that there is necessarily a problem with children or adults engaging in virtual behavior that is violent. There's no evidence, and despite a substantial disinformation campaign that existed in the early 2000s, to suggest that acting violently in video games causes violence in the real world. Actually, to the contrary, there's some evidence that video games are one place where aggressive impulses can be displaced, right? So if you can pour it into the virtual world, so it's less likely to break out into the physical world. And but that doesn't mean that games are always a sufficient way to vent one's aggression. Again, experience always needs to be balanced with reflection. But of course, if kids are staying up all night and are tired the next morning, that's a problem, right? Just like it would be if they were doing anything that was seriously interfering with their ability to function in the day-to-day world that kids are, have to participate in and don't have a lot of choice over, like going to school. And so, again, I think that the way in to a situation like that is to think about why they're playing this game, what it means to them, thinking about things like, what are the rules in these households? Why is it in their bedrooms, or why are they allowed to play so late? And these are all points of where potential boundaries can be set that can't be kind of eschewed under the guise of like, well, it's an addictive video game. Right? I think that sometimes the fear that we have about games can also be a way of sort of abdicating responsibility in some way over how we play games, either how we're governing our children's use if we're an adult with a child, or how adults justify their own use, right? That I've certainly worked with many people who have sort of internalized the shame and the sense of addiction with video games, and they really come to me with this idea of like, I can't stop. It's not my fault. It's just, and then of course, when you get into it, even before we get into the more complex psychological dynamics, there may be some very obvious things like that they have their computer set up next to their bed, right? Or that they have joined a clan, which is sort of like a social group of gamers who are in a different time zone. So if they want to play with them, they always have to be up in the middle of the night, right? So there are things that there are active choices that people make, again, either for themselves or in how they choose to talk about or set boundaries with their children, that probably are more impactful on in terms of how it's affecting sleep patterns and these sort of things in the game itself.
Thank you. There does seem to be this rift just between approaches of parents, and one set of parents' lack of control of what happens in the friend's household. So your kid might have certain rules and not have the computer in their bedroom, but his best friend is totally in this zone. So you can't parent other parents. So there's just such differences of opinion, which is the same about how people feel about use of cell phones.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not, it's not a new concept of the human condition, right? That one of the challenges of raising children is that you are raising them alongside of the people, right? That can bring so many benefits of community and togetherness, and it can also mean that your values have to come up against the values of other families that may not sync with your own. And video games, I think, are one prism through which this gets funneled now, because video games are so popular. But I think that it's not necessarily a unique contributor to that problem, except for the fact that our misunderstanding of video games can sometimes make it easier to sort of not see how much room we have to actually work with boundaries and with our children, right? Even if you're dealing with that situation where a child is sort of being pulled in one direction because his best friend has less rules in the house about games, that still doesn't foreclose you, in that case, having open and honest dialogues with your child about games and why they play and what they get out of it, and understanding the different aspects of that dynamic, including perhaps the transgressive thrill of playing games at the friend's house but they're not allowed to play at your house, right, or whatever the case may be. It's all kind of grist for the mill. It's all ways in which we can better understand our children and who they are growing up to be. But, if your local Village bookstore is a great place. I've gotten a couple of deliveries from them since this all started. And it's great. It's a great time to support independent bookstores.
Yeah, I know they're struggling, but they're finding a way to maintain nonetheless, because people want their media now more than ever. And I also put a link to donate if you feel so inclined. No pressure, but we really appreciate your support. And I just appreciate everybody coming out today when I know you have so many choices and you are piled on top of your families. But good luck, and thank you, Alex, for coming out.
Great. Thanks so much.
Have a great night, everybody.
You too.